Scary telling.
I couldn't get the image of the deer monster out of my head. It felt like it was following me everywhere I went. But that wasn't the only strange thing happening in our town. Animals were disappearing, and people were reporting strange sightings in the nearby woods. My mother seemed to know more than she was letting on. She would speak in riddles about balance and ecosystems, and she always seemed to know exactly where to plant flowers and herbs. But now, it all made sense. My mother was protecting us from the monsters that lived among us. When my mother finally told me the truth, I was shocked. Monsters? In our town? But the more she explained, the more it all started to make sense. The creatures were part of an ancient ecosystem that had existed long before humans arrived. They had adapted to live alongside us, but they needed to hunt to survive. My mother explained that the deer monster I had seen was just one of many creatures that roamed the nearby woods. There were others, some with even more terrifying abilities. But my mother had a plan. We needed to leave town to stay safe. We packed our belongings and headed out of town in the middle of the night. My mother had a map of safe zones where the creatures were less likely to go, but we had to cross through the woods to get there. I was terrified, but my mother kept her cool. She knew the woods like the back of her hand, and she led us through the trees with ease. But then we heard something. A rustling in the bushes. My heart rate skyrocketed, and my mother motioned for me to stay quiet. We huddled together as a pack of creatures emerged from the bushes. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They had the body of a wolf but the head of a deer. Their eyes glowed in the dark, and they looked hungry. My mother told me to stay still and not make a sound. She stepped forward, her arms held out in front of her. The creatures growled and snarled, but my mother kept her cool. She spoke to them in a language I didn't recognize, and slowly the creatures backed away. We made it through the woods, but I was shaken. My mother had known about these monsters all along, and now we were running from them. I couldn't believe it. But as we left town behind, I knew that there was no going back. I had seen the true face of evil, and it was always lurking just beneath the surface. As we continued through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. My mother kept her hand on my shoulder, reassuring me that everything was going to be all right. We had a map of safe zones, but we had to cross through dangerous territory to get there. My mother had been mapping the creatures' movements for years, and she knew their hunting patterns better than anyone. But even with her knowledge, the journey was far from easy. We encountered traps set by the creatures, including snares and tripwires. My mother expertly avoided them, but it was clear that the monsters were closing in on us. We had to keep moving. As we trekked through the woods, we came across a hunting party. It was a group of the wolf deer creatures we had encountered earlier, but this time they were not alone. They had a few others with them, creatures that were even more terrifying than the ones we had seen before. My mother told me to stay back and keep quiet. She stepped forward, her arms held out in front of her, and spoke to them in the same language she had used before. The creatures growled and snarled, but my mother didn't back down. After what felt like an eternity, the creatures backed away, and we were able to continue on our journey. As we got closer to the safe zone, the creatures became more aggressive. They seemed to sense that we were getting away, and they weren't going to let us go without a fight. We encountered another hunting party, this time with more creatures than before. They had us surrounded. My mother handed me a weapon, a sharp blade she had been carrying with her. She told me to stay close and not to let the creatures get the best of me. The battle was intense, and the creatures were relentless, but we managed to hold our ground. In the end, we emerged victorious. We were battered and bruised, but we had made it to the safe zone. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened. My mother told me that we were safe for now, but we couldn't let our guard down. The monsters were always watching, always waiting for their next meal. We had to keep moving, keep fighting, if we were going to survive. The safe zone was a small community of people who, like us, were hiding from the monsters. They welcomed us with open arms and gave us a place to rest and recover. But my mother knew that we couldn't stay there for long. The monsters were always on the hunt, and they would find us eventually. My mother told me that we needed to confront the monsters head on. We couldn't keep running forever. We needed to fight back. She handed me a weapon, a silver dagger that she had forged herself, and told me that it was time to face our fears. We made our way back into the woods, this time with a purpose. We were looking for the monster's lair, the place where they retreated to after a hunt. My mother had been mapping the area for years, and she knew exactly where to look. As we crept through the woods, we could hear the monster's growls in the distance. They knew we were coming, and they were preparing for a fight. We encountered more traps along the way, including pits and spikes, but my mother expertly avoided them. Finally, we came to the entrance of the monster's lair. It was a cave, deep in the heart of the woods, surrounded by trees that seemed to twist and turn in unnatural ways. My mother told me to stay close, and we stepped inside. The cave was dark and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. We could hear the monster's growls getting louder and louder as we crept deeper into the cave. Suddenly, they were upon us. A pack of the wolf-deer creatures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the dark. They snarled and growled, and my mother and I stepped forward to meet them. The battle was intense, and the creatures were fierce. They had the advantage of numbers, but we had the advantage of surprise. My mother expertly wielded her weapon, and I followed her lead, striking at the creatures with my silver dagger. As we fought, I began to notice something strange happening to the creatures. They were starting to change. Their bodies were shifting and contorting, and their eyes were turning red. Suddenly, one of the creatures transformed into a human. It was Mr. Benson, the old man who lived down the street from us. He looked just as surprised to see us as we were to see him. My mother told me to stand back and let her talk to him. She spoke to him in the same language she had used before, and I watched as Mr. Benson's body contorted and twisted back into its original form. My mother explained to me that the monsters had the ability to shapeshift. They could take on the form of humans or animals, whichever was most convenient for them. But they couldn't keep up the charade forever. Eventually, their true form would reveal itself. The battle was long and grueling, but in the end, we emerged victorious. We had defeated the monsters, but the cost was high. My mother was wounded, and we were both exhausted. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened. My mother told me that we had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The monsters would regroup and come back stronger than ever. We had to keep fighting, keep moving, if we were going to survive. After the battle, we returned to the safe zone to rest and recover. My mother's wounds were severe, and I was worried that we wouldn't make it through the night. But she was a fighter, and she refused to give up. As she rested, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had seen things that I never thought were possible, and I had fought creatures that I never thought existed. It was a lot to take in. The other people in the safe zone were kind and welcoming, but they were also cautious. They knew the dangers of the outside world, and they knew that we couldn't stay in one place for too long. We were on the run, and we needed to keep moving. My mother and I talked about what had happened and what we needed to do next. She explained that the monsters had been around for centuries, hiding in plain sight, and that there were others like her who had been fighting against them for years. My mother had been preparing me for this fight my entire life, she said. She knew that eventually the monsters would come for us, and she wanted me to be ready. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but looking back, I could see how every little thing she had taught me had prepared me for this moment. As we rested and recovered, I began to process what had happened to us. I had seen things that I never thought were possible, and I had fought creatures that I never thought existed. It was a lot to take in, and I knew that it would take time for me to fully process everything. My mother and I spent the next few days resting and recuperating, but we both knew that we couldn't stay in one place for too long. The monsters were always on the hunt, and we needed to keep moving. As we prepared to leave the safe zone, I felt a sense of determination wash over me. I was no longer the scared, unsure person I had been just a few days ago. I was a fighter, a survivor, and I was ready to take on whatever came our way. My mother and I set out on our journey, our hearts heavy with the knowledge that the monsters were still out there, waiting for us. But we were ready for them. We had fought them once, and we would fight them again if we needed to. We made our way through the woods, our eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. We knew that the monsters were watching us, waiting for their chance to strike. But we were ready for them. We had our weapons at the ready, and we were prepared to fight. As we walked, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. I had seen things that I never thought were possible, and I had fought creatures that I never thought existed. But I was no longer afraid. I was a survivor, and I was ready for whatever came our way. We traveled for days, always on the move, always watching our backs. The monsters were always on our tail, but we managed to stay one step ahead of them. Finally, we reached the heart of the monsters' territory. The land was barren and desolate, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. We knew that the monsters were nearby, waiting for us to make our move. My mother and I made our way through the wasteland, our weapons at the ready. We knew that the final battle was upon us, and we were prepared to fight to the death. Suddenly, the monsters emerged from the shadows. They were even more terrifying than I remembered, their eyes glowing red in the darkness. My heart raced as we stepped forward to meet them. The battle was intense, and the creatures were relentless. They seemed to come at us from all sides, their claws and teeth tearing our flesh. But we refused to give up. We fought with all of our might, striking at the monsters with our weapons. As we fought, I could see my mother's strength waning. Her wounds were too severe, and I knew that we couldn't keep up this pace forever. We had to end this now. I stepped forward, my silver dagger at the ready. I took a deep breath and charged at the monsters, striking at them with all of my might. They fought back, but I refused to give up. I knew that we were in this together, and I would do whatever it took to protect my mother. Finally, the creatures began to fall. One by one, they dropped to the ground, their bodies contorted and twisted. The battle was over, and we had emerged victorious. My mother and I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but relieved. We had finally defeated the monsters, but the cost was high. My mother's wounds were severe, and I knew that we had to get her to safety as soon as possible. We made our way out of the wasteland and back to the safe zone. The other survivors welcomed us back with open arms, and they tended to my mother's wounds. As she lay there, recovering, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had fought against the monsters and won. We had survived against all odds, and we had come out the other side stronger for it. My mother looked at me, a small smile on her face, and said, "You did well, my child. You are strong and brave, and I am proud of you." I knew then that everything we had been through had been worth it. We had faced our fears and come out the other side. And no matter what came our way in the future, I knew that we would face it together with strength and courage.